The Ice Spirit is a 1 elixir common that you probably see fairly often. It's certainly not the face of any deck given that it's so cheap, but that hasn't stopped it from contributing to some of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale history. Ice Spirit has certainly been one of the most important cards in the game's past, and I can't imagine what the game would be like without it. It's hardly received any balance changes over the years despite it being released all the way back in 2016, but there's still a lot to go over. So today we're going to cover the entire history of the Ice Spirit, why it's so special, why it was used in so many decks, and see how it's doing today. Ice Spirit was released on July 4th, 2016 as a 1 elixir common troop, but despite it being common, it was unlike most cards. You see, in Clash Royale, most troops will live until their health is fully depleted, but the Ice Spirit would die as part of its attack. We already saw this mechanic with the Fire Spirits. Ice Spirit was a different version of this idea. Fire Spirits were a 2 elixir swarm card where together they could take out a lot of low to medium health units, but Ice Spirit would be running as a solo 1 elixir unit. The fact it was 1 elixir by itself made it notable. Skeletons were the only other 1 elixir card at the time, meaning they had a monopoly over the 1 elixir category. They were highly used partly because having a card that let you cycle so quickly was an advantage in itself. Now they would have some competition. Compared to just a single Fire Spirit, its damage was far from impressive. It wasn't even enough to take out a Spear Goblin. It would really only take out skeletons or Fire Spirits. But the damage was at least enough so that Princess Towers could take out minions in one shot rather than 3 when they were hit with one. In addition to being cheaper, this unit had more health than a Fire Spirit. Fire Spirits were extremely fragile, and although Ice Spirit was certainly no tank itself, it could at least survive the Zap spell, which was nice because you wouldn't really have to worry about it being instantly taken out if used on defense. It also took 3 hits from a Princess Tower to kill rather than 2, so it could reach the tower by itself. A 1 elixir card being able to shift the tower on its own was a really big deal. Skeletons would often be cycled just because the user wanted to get to a different card in their deck, but they would essentially go to waste since they were weak. But with this, the opponent either had to let it get damage on their tower or use elixir to defend it. And of course, being a 1 elixir unit, there was no way to get a positive elixir trade on it. You couldn't get cheaper than 1. Of course, being an Ice Spirit, it came with a special effect unlike the Fire Spirits. Upon a successful connection with its target, it would freeze it for 2 full seconds. For half the cost, you were getting twice the freeze time as a Zap spell, and Zap was already very strong. Of course, you have to consider the fact that Zap is guaranteed and can be played anywhere instantly, but still, with Ice Spirit being able to survive a Zap, move at a very fast movement speed, and have half a tile more of jump range, it could very quickly get where it needed to go and get successful connections consistently. It definitely had a lot going for it, but how would it perform? Well, it may surprise you to know Ice Spirit had a bit of a slow start. It certainly wasn't a bad card by any stretch, but not a lot of people were exactly jumping on it right away. The Zap spell was just overwhelmingly popular, and since it served a similar function to Ice Spirit, you didn't really need both, even though there were some troops both Ice Spirit and Zap could counter well as a combo. This was a good environment for cycle decks, but the Elixir Collector already helped those decks cycle quicker, and Skeletons were still really good value for 1 elixir. Some argued it was just a worse alternative to Fire Spirits, but as time went on, more and more top players were finding success with it, with some insisting that it was underrated and would soon be meta. By the beginning of August, it was being pushed to number 1 in the world in Minor Cycle. You were also beginning to see it more in Hog Cycle, and even with 3 Musketeers. It took a bit to get going, but its popularity was spiking. Ice Spirit was just a more complicated card that took a bit of knowledge to get adequate value out of. He was okay as a throwaway cycle card, but if you could go that extra step to learn the interactions, he could be a machine. For example, it was discovered that an Ice Spirit with the assistance of the towers could fully counter split-placed archers with perfect placement and timing. It's also worth noting that Zap was nerfed in August as well, making it not so dominant, opening up room for cheap stun freeze alternatives to shine. Despite it becoming very prominent on top ladder, it was still not being used too much in the lower areas of ladder. It really went to show how high of a skill ceiling this card had. It may seem like playing a 1 elixir card badly wouldn't be the end of the world since it's just 1 elixir, but really understanding its limits and interactions was important to getting proper value out of it. A 26% use rate was above average, but nothing mind-blowing for the time, and given that Ice Spirit was in a category with not a lot of competition, and the fact that it took a fair bit of knowledge and skill to utilize properly, it was arguably in an excellent position. But its popularity was not slowing down. Ice Spirit kept skyrocketing in popularity going into September as Goizen or Giant Poison was peaking in popularity. Ice Spirit was nasty combined with the poison, being able to keep units in its radius longer. With the Poison Slowness, Zap Stun, and Ice Spirit's Freeze, it was really hard for the offender to break through. These were all generally powerful cards that couldn't really be countered. There were some popular variants of Giant Poison that didn't include Ice Spirit towards the beginning of the month, but by the end of September, I couldn't find a deck without one. And it had risen to be the most used troop in top ladder, appearing in nearly 2 in 3 decks. Most of these were Giant Poison, so I would say that definitely played a part in the upsurge, but it was still being seen in plenty of other cycle decks. Its true power was finally being recognized, but Giant Poison was way too strong, so when that combo was inevitably nerfed, how would Ice Spirit fare? Well, after the October balance changes, Giant Poison was no longer seen in competitive play, but despite that seemingly being a cause for Ice Spirit's skyrocketing usage, you didn't really see a fall whatsoever when Giant Poison fell. It just migrated into other decks. Now you were seeing Expo a lot in top ladder, and Ice Spirit worked great with that. It was clear at this point that it wasn't simply a matter of environment. Ice Spirit provided too much value. As the meta changed, he would find his way into whatever the most popular cycle decks were. He stayed as the most used troop card in top ladder throughout the entirety of October, and by the end was the second most used card period, second only to the log. It may not have felt too strong since at the end of the day, he was only 1 elixir and could only attack once with damage that couldn't even take out a goblin, but it was beginning to feel like you had to use him if you were a cycle player. And no matter how high skill cap and unintrusive a card may feel, more than 60% usage is too high. So it wouldn't be long before this card had to face the Nerf hammer. Ice Spirit's first balance change would arrive on November 1st, 2016, nearly 4 months since its release, which is a decent amount of time for any new card. In this set, his freeze time duration would be decreased from 2 to 1.5 seconds. This was a huge nerf, but arguably justified given how widely used he was. This was a bit of an odd card to balance given its nature. Obviously, it doesn't have a hit speed stat since it dies as part of its attack, and you couldn't really mess with the health, jump range, or movement speed without changing major interactions that were arguably important to the card's health and a big reason to use it over Fire Spirits. This meant freeze duration and damage were really the only stats you could change without messing up the card too much. It was too early to tell if this would be a balancing nightmare though, because this was its first balance change. It needed time to settle in. Shortly following the changes, the Spirit had a big fall. It wasn't as versatile anymore, which limited what it could thrive in. You were still seeing it a lot with Hog Rider and Expo, but not much else. It wasn't exclusively with those win conditions, but outside of them it was pretty niche. That was okay though, because he was still seen in more than a quarter of top ladder decks for the remainder of 2016. And things were holding steady going into 2017. It was dwindling in popularity a little bit due to an unfavorable developing landscape, but nothing to worry about. What there was to worry about was the January balance changes, which would target the Ice Spirit for the second time. On January 23rd, Ice Spirit would get nerfed again. Even though it wasn't quite the best environment for this card, it still provided a lot of value, inciting Supercell to decrease his damage by 10%. Now, he wouldn't bring the minion's health down to 1 tower shot. He was pretty much able to counter a minion horde by himself before, which is a +4 positive trade, and that was a bit too much for the team. Ice Spirit already dealt so little damage that 10% wasn't an insane amount, but it definitely hurt the card a bit, and we could see that within 1 week of this change going live, its usage fell to the lowest it's been at since its release month all the way back in July 2016. Although it seemed to be dying from first impressions, time would only prove that notion to be drastically incorrect. Expo and Hog Rider were still playing it a lot, as the freeze was really the main function of it in those decks, as it protected the win conditions. Plus, since Zap didn't take out goblins anymore, the Spirit could finish them off with the assistance of a Zap now. And you were starting to see a lot more people utilize the combination of Skeletons and Ice Spirit, which wasn't really thinkable a few months before. You had seen some decks use both of them before, but it didn't really start to take off until 2017. The Elixir Collector was nerfed drastically towards the end of 2016, which had been a staple of cycle decks. It wasn't as versatile now, so cycle players had to adapt their strategy. Both Skeletons and Ice Spirit provided good value, but were generally weak cards given their cheaper cost. Dedicating 1/4 of your deck to 1 Elixir cycle card seemed like too much because you needed to have room for cards that could actually counter bigger cards. But top players were proving that if used correctly together, they could provide insane value. The Ice Spirit freezing its target gave the Skeletons a lot of time to deal with the offending unit, and there were just so many amazing plays you could make with them for huge positive elixir trades, which allowed you to play your win condition more often. It took a lot of knowledge to utilize this combo, and it was easy to mess them up and get overwhelmed, but those who mastered it were rewarded greatly. The placement for some of these interactions had to be absolutely perfect, so although it did have a major fall initially after the January nerf, by the end of February it recovered to being in a quarter of top ladder decks. On top of the cycle decks I've already discussed, we also began to see Ice Spirit making frequent appearances in a developing archetype known as bait, or in this case more specifically, log bait. It was around this time when one of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale history was emerging, which is simply known as log bait, the classic variant. Bait is all about overwhelming your opponent with cards that would typically be hard countered by a spell, knowing they can't use that spell on all of them. This was the deck that you wanted to cycle quickly, so Ice Spirit was a natural fit. It also synergized fairly well with the Goblin Barrel, because the Ice Spirit could tank for the goblins, then freeze the tower, giving the goblins a lot of extra time to attack. If the log was out of rotation, it could be devastating. This would certainly carry Ice Spirit far, but as of now this was just one of many decks to help bring Ice Spirit to its fullest potential. The next significant development was in June, where the 1 elixir skeletons were nerfed, making Ice Spirit more appealing as a cycle player's 1 elixir option. Ice Spirit had been working decently with skeletons, but they were still pretty competitive, so skeletons being beaten down helped Ice Spirit's rates to skyrocket. By the end of June, it was the second most used card in top ladder, second only to the log once again. Not only were skeletons much weaker, but Battle Ram had also been rising at the same time, and Ice Spirit was a good way to reset its charge. It would continue to maintain this popularity as bats were buffed in the August balance changes. Ice Spirit wasn't the greatest counter, but it could usually take care of at least 3 or 4 of them for 1 less elixir than it cost to play the bats, making it decent in some scenarios. The August season saw Ice Spirit used in 4 of the top 5 popular finishing decks if you combine the slight variants of those decks together. It was practically a must-have if you were a cycle player at this point, and this was a cycle-heavy meta. For pretty much the rest of the year, Ice Spirit remained as the most popular troop card in top ladder. The decks that it worked well in weren't falling out, and Supercell continued to ignore it despite the overperformance. I think you could easily argue that there just needed to be more competition in the 1 elixir category. The options were so limited and there was a high demand for 1 elixir cards, so naturally they're going to see a lot of usage unless they're really bad. But they weren't adding any more 1 elixir cards. At least not anytime soon. Ice Spirit and Skeletons were the only options for a really long time. I think a big part of the reason for not adding any more was because it was tricky to balance the existing 1 elixir cards. Skeletons especially were a card the devs tried to balance quite a bit in 2016 and 2017, but were struggling to find a decent middle ground. Plus, how would the devs even go about creating another 1 elixir card? What I'm saying is, the problem seemed to be a lot bigger than Ice Spirit. However, in December 2017, Supercell would finally crack down on log bait, which had been the #1 most popular deck for months at this point, nerfing 6 of the 8 cards in the classic variant. But despite consistently being the second most popular card in that deck, Ice Spirit managed to slide under the radar, being one of the only 2 classic log bait cards to avoid the nerf hammer that month. And there weren't even dozens of angry comments berating Supercell for not nerfing it. From all the forums and videos I checked, I only found 1 comment suggesting an Ice Spirit nerf, despite the fact that Ice Spirit was the most popular troop card in top ladder for 4 months straight up to that point, and it was still one of the most used troops for several months before that. By the end of the year, even some beatdown players were throwing in Ice Spirit. Being a 1 elixir reset against Infernos, it could be a lifesaver for tanks. At this point, even Skeletons were paling in comparison to it. Was Ice Spirit really just going to get away with it? Would something ever be done? The first few months of 2018 continued to be steady. Plenty of cycle decks including Logbait, Siege, and Hog Rider were riding high, and you were still seeing Ice Spirit and Giant Beatdown decks a lot. No matter the environment, it was going to thrive. It was so versatile because it could do so well against so many troops. Like, what other troop could prevent 2 Mega Minion shots for a +2 positive elixir trade, take out clumps of bats and skeletons, and completely reset the attack of multiple troops who take several seconds to charge up? No matter what you played against, Ice Spirit would be able to help in some way. Which is why it's no surprise to see it still being used in around 40% of top ladder decks consistently. Finally, in April 2018, Supercell would take direct action against this mini monster. It had been well over a year since its last nerf, and it had absurdly high usage ever since the Skeletons nerf from the previous June. First, its damage was decreased by 4%. There weren't really any notable interaction changes from this. The most notable one was that now an Ice Spirit plus one of the Electro Wizard's beams would not be able to take out a minion anymore. It was the maximum damage it could be nerfed without taking away its ability to take out fire spirits. Even 1% more damage lost would change that interaction. The real significant nerf here was its freeze duration being decreased by another half second, meaning it would only last 1 second now, which is half the time it was upon release. They really came down hard on the little guy here. It was arguably justified given how prominent it was, but the community was overwhelmingly against this change. When looking at top ladder rates, it's more than obvious as to why he needed a nerf, but in the lower areas, he didn't seem so bad. And this is where the majority of players resided, so of course the majority opinion is going to be based on the mid-ladder experience. He also just didn't feel like a problem to a lot of players. The Ice Spirit doesn't feel as impactful as the Hog Rider or Expo he's supporting. Many players attribute those win conditions to be the problem because they're the ones doing the majority of the damage to towers, failing to recognize part of the reason they're able to get so much damage is because of the Ice Spirit's support. Ice Spirit was a really fun card, so seeing it nerfed so much was devastating, as popular cards typically are. This card had remained unchanged for so long that players got adjusted to it being as strong as it was. Even if it was rightfully nerfed, those players would have a tougher time now and have to readjust their strategy that they've been used to for a long time now. Now, this nerf was successful in bringing Ice Spirit more in line with other low-cost cycle cards, but there was a general meta shift that can be attributed to this nerf. When a very prominent card suddenly becomes not prominent, that's going to happen. With Ice Spirit nerfed, Balloon had more room to thrive. They seem unrelated, but Ice Spirit and Tornado had been used to counter many things at the top level, and Balloon was a prime victim of this combo. Ice Spirit and Tornado were useful not just for keeping it away from the tower for a long time, but keeping it in the range of both towers. However, with the freeze being less, that play was far less effective, effectively helping Balloon a lot, which ultimately led to a Mega Minion rise. I am simplifying this a bit, as there's lots of factors that go into developing the meta, but the Ice Spirit nerf definitely played a part in this. It's just one of the many examples of how nerfing a single card can lead to a chain reaction in the meta. Although Ice Spirit was far from its peak now, it continued to see success in the same cycle decks it had been appearing in before. Not much changed except how popular those decks were. Its future was still up in the air though. Time would only tell if this nerf went too far. Ice Spirit was holding pretty steady in 2018. We still saw Classic Log Bait a lot, but there are two other decks I need to mention that had already been popular for a while, being Expo 2.9 and Hog 2.6. These are just as, if not more iconic than Classic Logbait, being decks that would survive and see use no matter how the meta shifted. The fact that Ice Spirit played a role in 3 of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale history that were all different archetypes really goes to show its versatility and influence. With these decks thriving, Ice Spirit would always have a place. He was irreplaceable. But despite his continued presence in these 3 popular decks, you weren't seeing quite as much new development as you were before the April nerf. Every top Beatdown, Mortar, and 3 Musketeer deck weren't running it anymore, and a lot of the new deck variants of the win conditions he was still appearing with were often leaving him out. You were seeing him a decent amount in some minor poison variants though. Other than that, however, you weren't really seeing it appear in any new top decks. The old ones maintained a decent amount of popularity, but how well they actually performed varied on other environmental factors. They weren't the drivers themselves anymore. Just because they were some of the most used decks doesn't mean they were necessarily the best decks. And we could see this directly reflected in Ice Spirit's performance. Its use rate was dwindling in the coming months, and towards the end of the year, the win rate was hovering around the low 40s, indicating that it was a bit on the weaker side. It certainly didn't feel like it given the variety of decks you continuously saw it in, but those decks were getting weaker, and without many new decks to support it, it's no surprise to see the fall. It was looking like the card was dying out, and given some more time it would sink to an unviable level and require a buff. But this dwindling trend would not continue forever. Towards the end of March, beginning of April 2019, Ice Spirit would see a sharp rise in use and win rates. Not only was the Expo buffed in March, which had been one of the Ice Spirit's primary partners, but we saw a new cheap Royal Giant deck begin to trend. We hadn't really seen Ice Spirit with Royal Giant before, so considering Ice Spirit had been on a downward spiral for about a year up to this point, it's surprising to see it play a part in a new trending deck that managed to push to #1 in the world. This deck was built around cycling quickly, and with there being no other 1 elixir options since skeletons were already included, Ice Spirit was all you had. It didn't really feel like Ice Spirit synergized well with the Royal Giant, rather it was primarily there for quick cycle. And was that really a good place for a card to be in? Only being relevant for being cheap and helping the player get to the more valuable cards quicker? Competition seems desperately needed. Zap and Log were also examples of cards that were drastically overused compared to the average card, but people argued against nerfing them, citing that it was a high demand and lack of competition attributed to their high usage rather than them being generally too strong. So what did they do? They added Barbarian Barrel and the Giant Snowball to compete, and it helped even the playing field a bit. But since Ice Spirit was performing average to below averagely, it meant that if new competition did arise, it would almost certainly need a buff. Now, they actually did decrease the heal spell's cost to 1 elixir in January 2019, but it was so laughably awful that it's not even worth considering it as a 1 elixir competitor. Ice Spirit's usage stayed relatively high despite its win rate not quite catching up. At least it was staying at 45% or above for the most part now, which is the minimum win rate Supercell considers a healthy card to have. The second half of 2019 was a bumpy period though. At this point, Expo seemed to be doing most of the heavy lifting for Ice Spirit's relevance, and it had a small upsurge in August as a response to the P.E.K.K.A. uprise. However, even in this environment, the only variant of Expo you were seeing Ice Spirit in was the classic 2.9 variant, which had been around for years at this point. It was absent from the Pump and, ironically, Icebo variants. You were also seeing it in more Hog Earthquake decks as Barbarian Barrel was nerfed in August, making Ice Spirit a more appealing option by comparison. Although it seemed to be dying out in 2018, 2019 proved this little guy still had some good life left in him. He just wasn't quite settling in one place. The last 3 months of the year would shift into a heavy Elixir Golem beatdown environment, which was not good for the Spirit. And even though Minor Cycle was still doing great, you weren't seeing a ton of Ice Spirit there because the wall breakers changed the way those decks were shaped. You did see a small spike in usage in November thanks to the rise of Ex-Nado, but by the time that settled down, Ice Spirit's rates were back to the lowest they've been in a while. Not much changed in the first few months of 2020. Despite Elixir Golem being toned down, Ice Spirit didn't really see a bounce back. But in April of that year, Supercell would do something unthinkable, something that was long overdue. They would add a new 1 elixir troop. On April 2nd, 2020, the Heal Spirit would replace the Heal Spell, finally providing some real competition in the 1 elixir space. The Ice and Fire Spirits had significant differences, but the Heal Spirit was very similar to the Ice Spirit. In addition to their elixir costs, they moved at the same speed, had the same jump range, splash radius, hit points, and damage. The only difference was that instead of freezing its target for 1 second, it would heal surrounding friendly units for 1 second. It was a carbon copy except for its core ability, giving players who needed another cycle card a viable alternative. Of course, freezing was a unique ability that would make it so Heal Spirit wouldn't be a direct replacement in any circumstance, but if you were just looking for something quick to cycle that could chip the tower or take out some swarms, Ice Spirit was not your only option. This had certainly been a factor in helping this card to survive as long as it did, so it's no surprise that following the release of Heal Spirit, Ice Spirit's rates fell even lower from what they already were. It wasn't being replaced in any of its long-standing decks, but you weren't seeing it really outside of it anymore. Heal Spirit was pretty strong, but it wasn't appearing often in archetypes you would have seen an Ice Spirit in before. Even though they were pretty similar, Supercell did a decent job making them different enough so they wouldn't step over each other. It was definitely worse than it was in 2019, but overall the rates did slightly recover and were fine. But Supercell wasn't done crowding the field yet. On October 14th, 2020, the Electro Spirit would be added, which again was very similar to the Ice Spirit, having a lot of the same stats but doing slightly less damage. And instead of doing splash damage, it would chain onto units, effectively functioning as a splash unit. Actually being more effective in a lot of cases because you didn't have to position the Spirit to make the radius encapsulate all of the units. As long as they were somewhat near each other, Electro Spirit would find its way. But the crazier part is that he would freeze any unit he hit for half a second, or half the time it lasted for the Ice Spirit. The Heal and Ice Spirit were vastly different with their abilities, but adding another 1 elixir unit that froze units was really digging into Ice Spirit's territory. The competition was heating up, and unlike the Heal Spirit who was mostly appearing in Beatdown or Royal Hog decks, Electro Spirit would really come after the Ice Spirit in some of the decks it had been working well in for years now. Although Electro Spirit outshined Ice Spirit in many aspects, one major disadvantage it had was that the opponent could easily activate their King Tower when it was coming at the tower by itself. This made it harder to use Electro Spirit with win conditions that relied on the King Tower staying inactive. Ice Spirit could be played more carelessly, which was important. This meant in decks like Logbait and Hog Rider, where an activated King Tower can really make a difference, Ice Spirit was safe for now. But in Expo, activating the King Tower didn't really matter, so a lot of those players switched to Electro Spirit. Ice Spirit was still the primary choice of Spirit in Expo decks, it just wasn't irreplaceable anymore. With 2 new 1 elixir spirits in the game, Ice Spirit lost one of the main things that made it valuable, leading to dwindling rates. The rates would continue to dwindle going into 2021, and you just weren't seeing Ice Spirit in anything new. Electro and Heal Spirit would appear in pretty much any new deck that needed a Spirit, but Ice Spirit held its spot in Expo 2.9, Hog 2.6, and Logbait, the same decks it had been seen in for nearly 4 years by this point. Even though it was certainly still viable, it didn't seem to be in the best position. And if things weren't looking bad enough, in June there would be another 1 elixir card added to the roster. The Fire Spirit, the only type of spirit in the game longer than Ice Spirit, would be reworked to 1 elixir and become a solo unit just like the other ones. Like the other spirits, its health was increased to survive zap and get to the tower on its own. Its jump range was increased, and other stats were adjusted to make it work like the others. The competition was really tough now. This spirit couldn't freeze anything, but it dealt a lot more damage and had a much bigger radius. This Hog Rider deck that Ice Spirit was popular in 2021 saw Fire Spirit not just replacing Ice Spirit sometimes, but becoming the dominant variant. With this and Electro Spirit siphoning off some Ice Spirit players in Expo 2.9, it was no surprise to see that by the end of the year, its use rate was still below average with a win rate in the mid-30s. These were awful rates. Ice Spirit had been balanced with the idea that it was the only 1 elixir spirit, but now there were 4. These down periods seemed to just happen because other spirits were too strong, so once they were nerfed, it would come back. But these down periods were getting worse and lasting for longer periods of time, and its long-term use and win rate were still on a downward trajectory. It was debatable which spirit was truly the best. They certainly each had their place, but it was pretty clear that Ice Spirit wasn't the best one anymore. In the few old prominent decks you still saw Ice Spirit in, they all had win rates below 50%. Some argue that it was because these decks were high skill, so lots of people who were playing them didn't know how to play them properly. But these decks had much better win rates when they were more popular years ago, so you can't attribute them solely to the fact that it may take a higher amount of skill to master these decks, especially because the Electro Spirit variant of Expo 2.9 had a higher win rate than the Ice Spirit variant. These decks were just far past their prime. That's why the win rate was getting lower. Players didn't just suddenly get worse, and on top of Fire Spirit replacing it in Hog Rider and Electro Spirit replacing it in Expo, Electro Spirit was also replacing it in Logbait now. Electro Spirit was really good for crowd control and cleaning up debris, and that's what was really needed in early 2022 thanks to the Skeleton King and the Swarm meta he brought about. Especially since he could also reset troops, Ice Spirit was incredibly niche. 2022 was going to be a rough year if nothing happened. Arguably, Ice Spirit could have stayed unchanged because although it was underused with a low win rate, it did have a place, and sometimes that's enough. But Supercell ultimately determined that wasn't enough because in April 2022, it received a buff. The first balance change it got in 4 years, and the first buff it received ever. In this patch, his freeze duration would be increased from 1 to 1.3 seconds. In their explanation, they explained that they wanted to make Ice Spirit more useful while keeping him separate from the Electro Spirit. So with that as the goal, increasing his freeze duration was the correct move. Also, just as a quick little fun fact, this is when Ice Spirit was confirmed to be male, as it was the first time he was referred to by personal pronouns. In previous explanations, he was simply referred to as it. Thanks to this freeze duration buff, he would stand out from Electro Spirit more and be more useful in certain scenarios. However, this didn't seem to make a difference at first, as even after letting it settle for a while, his rates were still about the same as they were before the buff, appearing in the same decks it had been appearing in for 5 years now. Even with a pretty generous buff, it was not enough for people to consider putting it in any new decks. It did have a small upsurge in October as the buff to Goblin Gang made Logbait popular again, but a large number of Logbait players continued to use Electro Spirit. Despite a pretty generous buff, the environment had changed so much since Ice Spirit was last competitively strong that something more was going to need to happen before players were enticed to use it again. And this development would come closer than you'd think, as at the end of October, Phoenix and Monk were released and they would warp the meta. These cards were really strong, which encouraged the user to play them a lot, and when you want to play a card a lot, you need to be able to cycle to them quickly. And even though there were plenty of other 1 elixir options, Ice Spirit was easily the most common spirit you'd see in a lot of Phoenix Monk decks, as its freeze was much more useful right now than the Electro Spirit's crowd control or Fire Spirit's damage. You mainly saw this in Minor Cycle, which had not been using Ice Spirit for a while up until now. Also in November, you saw this Royal Hog deck gaining popularity, and seeing Ice Spirit in this was huge because with Royal Hogs, you never really saw Ice Spirit before. And on top of this, Executioner was rising again to help satisfy the demand for Phoenix counters, meaning you saw a comeback of this Hog X Nano deck that Ice Spirit was present in. All in all, it was appearing to close in 1 in 4 Grand Challenge decks with an above average win rate, quite the stark contrast from just a few months prior. It had been trickling upward for a while now thanks to the Fire Spirit nerf in August and Goblin Gang buff in October, but it was clear the sudden upsurge was caused by the 2 recent overpowered cards. Luckily for this card though, even with the drastic toning down of Phoenix in December, it maintained pretty decent rates. However, the environment wasn't quite stable yet, as Supercell pulled another Supercell by overbuffing Mighty Miner, making it the new main meta driver. Not only was Ice Spirit useful for resetting its charge, but Mighty Miner was supporting Logbait a lot. You saw a lot of that this month, and you were also seeing Ice Spirit and Mortar again, but surely this was just a coincidence. This had to just be because Ice Spirit got lucky with a favorable environment for a couple metas in a row. Well, no. Even after Mighty Miner was toned down, Ice Spirit maintained decently high usage going into 2023. At this point, it was just generally outshining the Electro Spirit. All the decks where Electro Spirit had been previously siphoning a large chunk of Ice Spirit players off were pretty much all playing Ice Spirit again now. We could even see in February, Siege was very popular again thanks to a massive Archers buff, and all the top Siege decks ran Ice Spirit. It was clear at this point that it was by far the most dominant spirit, and it wasn't just a matter of a fortunate environment. Whether it was Hog Cycle, Bait, Siege, or pretty much anything you would see a spirit in, Ice was the go-to. This spirit saw more play in Grand Challenges than all of the other spirits combined. Mighty Miner may not have been where it was in December 2022, but it was still prominent in the Ice Spirit's best archetypes, helping to bring new life to them. Ice Spirit was thriving in 2023. It seemed to be just as good as it was in 2017. Despite the buff barely making a difference in performance for the first 4 months or so, it made a huge difference in the long run. With it dominating the 1 elixir space so much, Supercell decided in June 2023 to bring down the Nerf hammer once again. On June 6, 2023, Ice Spirit would receive its first change in over a year. Although not seeming like that effective of a buff at first, it had proven to be too much, so they were meeting in the middle of the pre- and post-April 2022 Ice Spirit by decreasing its freeze duration by 1/10 of a second. This was pretty unnoticeable to the average player, but since 1 second had been too short and 1.3 was too long, making it 1.1 or 1.2 was a logical step. However, this wouldn't lead to a major drop in play, but rather a few weeks after the buff, its usage would skyrocket to higher than it was before the nerf. This is because later in the same month the balance changes were applied, evolutions would be added to the game, and one of those evolutions, Firecracker, would be very good. Meta warping, in fact. Evolutions in general made Cycle very good again, but this specific Hog Mighty Miner deck that ran Ice Spirit was trending, with it still appearing in the decks it had been present in for over 6 years, combined with the new Cycle decks it was able to adapt into. Ice Spirit wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, which is why it was a bit surprising to see that in December of that year, we would see the Ice Spirit get an evolution of its very own. Evolutions were still pretty new at this point, and they'd been seen as a good thing to help boost weaker cards, and Ice Spirit was certainly not weak. But it was Christmas time, so they needed a winter-related card to give an evolution. When an evolved Ice Spirit hit its target, it would act exactly like a normal Ice Spirit, but after 1.8 seconds of the freeze wearing off, it would freeze for an additional 1.2 seconds and do another burst of damage to its target, then one more time after that. If its target died while it still had charges, it would just freeze the surrounding area from where it died. It was basically 3 Ice Spirits packed into one. This made it really strong against cards that had to build up a charge. The total damage was barely more than a log, and the Ice Spirit had to jump on its target to have any effect at all. By today's standards, not having any base stat increases is normal for most evolutions, but back then, it was weird. Evolved Ice Spirit would still die to many small spells, forcing you to play carefully if you wanted to utilize its value. But if not having any stat increases wasn't enough, that wasn't all. It would also take 3 cycles of the base card to get to the evolved version. This is the only evolution that would have 3 cycles, so even though it was only 1 elixir, it would take a while to get to. Even the skeletons were a 2-cycle evolution despite costing the same. The community was overwhelmingly underwhelmed at the first glance of this. It was expected that this evolution would flop. Why would you use this one over the evolved Knight or Archers who had significant stat bonuses as well as cooler abilities? Remember, this was back when you could only use 1 evolution per deck, and this was the 10th one. It wasn't just about competing with the other cards, it was about competing with the other evolutions for that 1 slot. Obviously, having an Ice Spirit that can do triple the damage and freezing every 4th play is better than having an Ice Spirit that can't do that. But taking that over, say, Archers that can survive arrows and deal double their damage every 3rd play was hard to pass up. Of course, first impressions can be wrong as they have been at times in the past, but pretty quickly after release, it was clear that Ice Spirit was by far the worst evolution. I'm not sure what Supercell was thinking. This evolution had so many disadvantages compared to the others. Obviously, the base card was already really good, but if that's the case, then people will just keep using the base card and not the evolution. It was so bad that they didn't even wait a full season to take action. Only 9 days after its release, they gave it an unscheduled buff, reducing the number of cycles to play it from 3 to 2. It seems like they had been trying to be safe with the release of new evolutions, since almost every previous one had disrupted the meta, requiring almost instant nerfs. So rather than releasing it too strong, they release it weak and slowly buff it. A 1 cycle reduction is a pretty big buff, but considering it was laughably bad before this, it was unclear whether this would make a difference. Jumping ahead to January 2024, we can see Evolved Ice Spirit still had abhorrent raids, by far the worst of any evolution. On the contrary, the base Ice Spirit was still a top tier card, appearing in nearly a quarter of Grand Challenge decks. It was still appearing in so many different decks and archetypes. At this point, it was being used about 3 times as much as all the other spirits combined. It was very odd to see a base card outperform their evolved variant, especially by so much. In all of the decks it was thriving in, not one of them were strengthened by giving the spirit of all cards the honor of the evolution slot. Luckily though, things were about to change. In February of that year, the second evolution slot would finally be added, meaning evolutions didn't have to compete with each other so much anymore. Rather than there only being 1 slot among the now 13 evolutions that were in the game, you could pair them with each other. It was perfect, especially since a lot of the decks Ice Spirit were thriving in didn't have any other cards with evolutions yet. However, not only did we barely see a rise of Evolved Ice Spirit usage following the second slot addition, but the base Ice Spirit had a substantial drop since people were just using other cheap evolutions to facilitate a quick cycle. Overall, the second slot was not good for the Ice Spirit. It just helped other evolutions take places the base Ice Spirit would have otherwise been. Seeing this dwindling performance, Supercell would take further action in the March balance changes. Finally, they were giving the Evolved Ice Spirit a stat buff, increasing its splash radius from 1.5 to 2 tiles. This seemed counterintuitive since this would make it more of a crowd control card, a thing they'd been trying to avoid since it would take purpose away from the Electro Spirit, but I guess they didn't care at this point. And to be clear, this would apply to all 3 waves. It certainly seemed like being able to hit more troops would be an incentive for more people to use him, but it was not even close to enough. Its use and win rate were as low as they were before the second slot was added, and even the base Ice Spirit was still trickling down. Not only were there evolutions crowding the field in April, but the Dagger Duchess Tower Troop was also really prominent, and it was encouraging a heavy beatdown environment as the Ice Spirit and many other cycle cards couldn't even make it to the tower against it. Now, there were some cycle decks that thrived in this period, especially after the Evolved Tessa rework, but these were all running Electro Spirit, as not being able to reach the tower on its own was actually an advantage for this card because it wouldn't accidentally activate the opponent's King Tower. But the Ice Spirit, base, and Evolved would not be receiving any more balance changes anytime soon. However, that doesn't mean things wouldn't get better. In the May balance changes, every single, and I mean every single evolution would appear except the Ice Spirit. Some of them were receiving reworks, but a lot of them were getting straight nerfed. Since evolutions were way too strong compared to their base counterparts, they were minimizing their gap across the game. But since Evolved Ice Spirit's base counterpart was wildly outperforming it, being the exception, it didn't need a nerf. Everything else being toned down was basically an indirect buff to the Evolved Ice Spirit. Despite all that though, it was still a Dagger Duchess heavy environment, meaning you weren't going to see a lot of Ice Spirit for the foreseeable future. By June, Ice Spirit had the worst performance it's had pretty much ever. It had the lowest recorded use and win rate in Grand Challenges it's ever had, which makes it insane to grasp that its all-time peak of popularity was just around the corner. With Ice Spirit's evolution still being generally weak and Dagger Duchess keeping the heavy beatdown meta alive, the path ahead was looking dark. But little did anyone know yet that Ice Spirit's peak of all time would reside in the same month as its all-time low. Because on June 17, 2024, Clash Royale would release 3 new cards. And these cards were some of the, if not the most overpowered, broken, influential cards in Clash Royale history. Overnight, the meta completely warped around them, changing everything. We talked about Ice Spirit seeing some spikes in popularity coinciding with the release of new cards, because when a card is broken, you want to play it more, and 1 elixir cards help with that. But the new Goblin cards were more popular than any previously broken card in Clash Royale history, making the demand for 1 elixir cards spike more than it ever has before as well. Also, since the decks were built around the new cards that did not have evolutions, it left Ice Spirit as being one of the only cards used in the deck that had an evolution, making it used by default. Overnight, Evolved Ice Spirit's usage went from this to this. Combine that with the regular Ice Spirit's small bump in usage, and you get nearly half of Grand Challenge decks using Ice Spirit. It was the perfect environment for this card to thrive. Sure, it had little to do with its power and mostly to do with its cost, but a place in the meta is a place in the meta. Also, I know this is arguably not its peak of all time, since there were some periods in 2016 where it was used in nearly 2/3 of top ladder decks, but when looking at recorded challenge stats and knowing how many more cards are in the game now versus back then, this kind of performance is arguably way more impressive, even if all the top decks it was thriving in were just Goblin Machine Mirror Rage Cycle. Obviously, this was another environment that was not going to last. Ice Spirit would have a major fall after the emergency nerf that came 2 days after the new card's release. So you might think that's the end of it for now. A small uptick thanks to some new broken cards, then right back to being useless after that's fixed. But that wouldn't be the case. You still saw the base and evolved Ice Spirit more than you did pre-Goblin Machine after the nerfs. It was appearing with the new cards still, even though they weren't as popular, and the demand for evolved Ice Spirit was higher thanks to the rise of Prince and Ram Rider, cards that the Evo could reset multiple times, toning their threat. The Dagger Duchess would also finally get nerfed into irrelevance in July, allowing for cycle decks to better thrive again. Although more nerfs to the new cards and nerfs to the Prince and Ram Rider would come at the same time, the seeming reasons for Ice Spirit's jump in popularity. So surely now evolved Ice Spirit would fade into irrelevance? Well, once again, not exactly. You see, with every set of balance changes since May, the top evolutions have been getting further nerfed, so with every set of changes, Ice Spirit's evolution indirectly came a little bit better by comparison. So even with all of the recent major developments practically being undone, Ice Spirit Evolution's performance was pretty good in July. It was nothing spectacular, but these were at least competitively viable rates, and considering the base Ice Spirit was seeing a lot of usage again, the card overall was in a decent place. You were starting to see some true competitive decks embrace the evolved Ice Spirit that weren't just gimmicky chaotic decks as a result of an unsteady environment. Even though it was still widely seen as a joke, some players were utilizing the potential it had now, and the raids show it did have promise. Especially with Dagger Duchess out of the mix, base Ice Spirit was being integrated into new stabler meta decks. At this point, I don't think they really needed any balancing adjustments, but the developments would keep coming. This Royal Hogs deck with the evolved Skeletons and Ice Spirit that was already popular would become more popular as it consistently avoided the Nerf Hammer, and the Goblin Snipe would release in October, of which the Ice Spirit adapted nicely into. You were seeing both versions of Ice Spirit a lot with Ram Rider and Royal Hogs, which ultimately led to both of their use rates rising to nearly a combined 30%, and it maintained this through November where you saw it in even more archetypes. It had been creeping into so many archetypes, helping both versions of the Spirit to be incredibly popular. It wasn't just about working well with overpowered cards anymore, they were generally overpowered themselves. The standard power of an evolution had gone down so drastically that being able to freeze an enemy 3 times for a total of 3.6 seconds doing more than the damage of a log for 1 elixir was actually insanely valuable now. I look at the Ice Spirit as a good constant to determine the power level of the average evolution in 2024. It got buffed in March 2024, but even after that, it was easily one of the, if not the worst evolution in Clash Royale. But with no balance changes, it had slowly risen from unviable, to niche, to balanced, to strong, to overpowered. Not counting the very brief upticks it had thanks to very broken cards. Ice Spirit had been the most consistent evolution, receiving hardly any changes, yet slowly creeping its way into the meta as every other evolution was nerfed one by one every month, until eventually becoming a top tier. Some players were baffled as to how Ice Spirit could go from useless to overpowered with no direct changes, which is why I found it fascinating to go through everything and watch its development. It was so good now that many players were clamoring for it to be nerfed. It could shut down a lot of things, and to be fair, it always could. It was just so outshined by the other evolutions for so long, but they had all been nerfed, putting Ice Spirit in the spotlight, so it was his turn. On January 8th, 2025, the evolved Ice Spirit would receive its first ever nerf, which would be a rework. Its damage per tick would be increased by 48%, but the number of times it would freeze its target would be decreased from 3 to 2. So overall, its total damage was decreased by 6%, and it froze for 1.2 less seconds. However, on the plus side, it would take less time for the total damage to come out, and since it dealt more damage per wave, it could one-shot spear goblins now. It would certainly be a nerf, but at least they didn't go overboard. And that's really the last major Ice Spirit development. Since then, both versions of the Ice Spirit have continued to see decent usage. You've been seeing it in the same archetypes it's been appearing in for well over 6 months now, but overall, neither version is too overused. Combining both variants of the Ice Spirit, and it's still very widely used, but it doesn't feel broken or like much of a problem as it was for the last few months of 2024. Honestly, considering it's still so heavily used, I think another 1/10 of a second freeze duration nerf could be justified, but then increase the damage if that goes too far. However, it's still in a pretty solid place all things considered. Also, even though it's been well over a year since the Ice Spirit Evolutions edition, we have yet to see another Spirit get one, so perhaps that's what it'll take to provide some real competition. Besides that Dagger Duchess period, Ice Spirit has been a pretty solid card and it deserves it honestly. I can respect the skill it takes to make some of the insane plays I've seen him make. He has so much potential and I don't want to see a meta without it. But what do you think? Is Ice Spirit good where he is, or does he need some more adjusting? Also, let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.